Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bruce Murray, and I am the instructor of the EU and US Climate Change Mitigation course here at the University of Economics and Business. Today, we have a special privilege to be joined by Dr. Martin Frick from the World Food Programme Global Office in Berlin. Dr. Frick has more than 25 years of professional experience in United Nations government and NGO leadership in food systems, climate development, multilateral diplomacy, public diplomacy, and emergency response. In addition to serving as the World Food Programme Global Office Berlin Director since 2021, he has acted as interim director of the World Food Programme Office in Brussels to the European Union. And from 2017 to 2021, Dr. Frick served as Senior Director of the UNFCCC, where he oversaw the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Among other things, among his many other leadership roles, Dr. Frick has served as the Program Director of Kofi Annan's Global Humanitarian Forum, where he developed the foundational concept of climate justice, coining what now is an established term in the climate debate. He holds a PhD in law from Regensburg University in Germany and a diploma in international relations from the Sciences Po in Strasbourg in France. All right.
Hello.
Hello, Dr. Frick. I have just taken a few moments to introduce you and would like very much to thank you for joining us. As we understand it, you are coming to us from Hamburg.
That's right. And my apologies for being late. I had another obligation here that ran a little bit over time, but here I am, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
And it's a pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe. Well, maybe I start by a little introduction who I am and where I'm coming from. And I'm not doing that too long because, as my first ambassador told me when I joined the diplomatic service, what the world does not need is another memoir of a diplomat. But I started off as a diplomat because I studied law and I didn't like it and thought about what I can do with the law studies and ultimately ended up being a diplomat for German diplomacy. I rapidly became a negotiator for human rights and humanitarian affairs. And from there, I changed sides and worked with Kofi Annan back in 2007 on a thing that was on my radar already as a human rights negotiator, which was human rights and climate change. And that, you will not remember back if I look in your faces, but in 2007, climate change was perceived as being maybe a future problem, as an environmental problem, and the iconic figure was the little ice bear. And while it's all very bad for the little ice bear, there was little understanding that this really is about people. And so I co-sponsored for the European Union the first resolution ever on human rights and climate change. And that was a big learning experience for myself, because I never considered before that human rights might be anything related to climate change. But to cut a long story short, I then worked for Kofi Annan, and as a program director, suggested that what we do with the celebrity power that Mr. Annan had, and all his friends who were, well-known people like Jeffrey Sachs or Amartya Sen or Mary Robinson, and we took that to basically tell the world climate change has a human face, and built a whole conference around it. And in the opening panel of this conference, I had Richard Branson, the billionaire and the president of the Maldives, speaking about climate justice in a shared global ecosphere. That was the frame I gave to this talk. Mary Robinson was the moderator and asked me at the time, what do I mean with climate justice? And I said, well, it's simple. Those who contributed least are suffering most under the changing climate. And she found that interesting. We started a working group, and this is the origin of the term of climate justice, which then years later I introduced a young woman to the Secretary General of the United Nations by the name of Greta Thunberg, who then became quite famous with that climate justice narrative. And I'm saying that because that also relates to the job I'm having now. I'm working with the World Food Programme that I think many of you might know. We are the biggest humanitarian organization in the world, and we bring food to people in need. That's basically our core business and mandate. Most prominently, we are working now in Gaza, the worst food situation you could imagine in the entire world. We have more people inside Gaza be directly threatened to die from hunger than in the rest of the world combined. I mean, I say that again, 2.2 million people in Gaza, everybody hungry. 570,000, we estimate, are one step away from dying from famine. And so this is what keeps me busy currently. But then, of course, you know, it's burning all over the world. You have Sudan, you have South Sudan, you have Chad, and we estimate that in the Horn of Africa alone, you got some 22 million people acutely hungry. And it doesn't stop there. You have Syria, you have Afghanistan, you got the Democratic Republic of Congo, and now, just now in the headlines again, unfortunately, Haiti, which is a nightmare of gang violence and a total power vacuum. But I'm really in your hands to talk about the topics in more detail, and maybe I give you a short overview, and then you would come in with questions, because that's always more fun for me to interact with you than just to, you know, preach from the pulpit. What I wanted to say, and this is why I started with climate change, is that WFP is a bit of an odd UN organization, because we are doing two things as our core mandate. One is saving lives. There's a situation somewhere, we come in, we bring food, we make sure that people don't die from hunger. We do that as good as we can. We do it at scale. You know, it's a massive logistics enterprise, but of course it's never enough. We are currently 60% underfinanced, and from the about 330 million people who are acutely food insecure actually means hungry. It's just a fancy word for that. But people who don't really have enough to eat, don't know where their next meal is coming from, don't know how to feed their children. Out of them, we can maybe feed a third of them. And we have never been less financed than currently, given the needs that we are having. But on top of this, we are actually trying to make people more food secure. We are trying to help people to actually stand on their own 2 feet, to be able to produce their own food and grow their own food and become less dependent on foreign aid. And I think that's a massive topic. In a previous life, before I joined WFP, I led operationally the Food System Summit of the Secretary General, where we spoke about food as a system. And while the UN had food summits before, this was really the first time that we looked at food with a systemic lens. What do I mean by saying that? Our food system is broken. We have basically around 800 million chronically hungry people, and as I said, about 1/3 billion acutely hungry people. But we also have more than 1 billion people being obese and getting sick because they are just way too overweight. We have the most severe social discrepancies in food systems. Think about the worst jobs that you can think of, and you will find exactly the jobs in food systems. It's migrant workers who work as food pickers. It's people who work in slaughterhouses. It's people who are washing dishes in restaurants. The food sector is providing a lot of jobs, but some of the crappiest jobs on this planet. So there is a big social dimension to food, obviously. And while I mentioned the number of people who don't know where their next meal is coming from, food is also, and often as nutritious food, a privilege of a few people. Because you don't only need calories to live, you need nutritious food, you need vitamins, you need minerals, you need protein, you need fresh produce. And in all too many places of the planet, this is becoming a privilege for very few. I'm telling you that in the last 2 years, we had 140 countries with basic food inflation of 25% and more, which basically means that if you're a doctor or a nurse or a teacher and you live on a public salary, what you have experienced in the last 2 years is that you are less and less able to even pay for staple foods for your family. Because the currencies, most of the currencies of the world are melting away compared to the US dollar. And then if you buy for a lot of money US dollars as a foreign currency, you are being punished again because the prices for staple food worldwide are maybe 22% higher than they were pre-COVID. So obviously, we need to look a little bit deeper into our economic system of food. And what we have there is that in many developing countries, you see a strong focus on producing cash crops for export. So you have countries exporting cotton or coffee or cacao or whatever the North American or European market wants to have. And quite often the same countries also suffer from hunger and malnutrition. If you see that the model has been for a long time that, the recommendation of FAO, World Bank, others was you focus on cash crops and don't worry about food too much because you can import cheaply from places like Ukraine, it's quite obvious that that formula doesn't quite work anymore. So what's the way out of it? It's certainly not only domestic production, but domestic production is a big part of it. People speak about food sovereignty, and they actually mean the possibility of a country to look after its own food and nutrition. And of course, we need much more local production, which is also a guarantee for more nutritious food. If you have a school and you want to feed the children, it's a pretty good idea if there is a community garden that's actually producing fresh produce for them. But then if you're in a place like Egypt, for example, there is no way around that you need to import about 80% of your food. In these places, you need to diversify your food sources. And we need to encourage, particularly on the African continent, trade between African countries, and not only as in a star system from an African country to the world market. Because if you stay locally, currency fluctuations don't play this much of a role, and inflation is basically something that is not affecting you if you have a backyard and you're growing your own food. Now, talking about diversifying and, more, I would say, artisanal ways of producing food is also a climate and a biodiversity imperative, which is another reason to support smallholder farmers and family farming. As we see the impacts of climate change getting more severe by the year, and you see actually even areas in the US Midwest where no insurance company is still ready to pay you or to grant you an insurance because the premiums would just be too high and the risk is too high. We need to brace for the impacts of climate change. The world has basically slept for 28 years, not taking decisive action early enough. And today we see a staggering number of climate-related disasters, and every year more. When I was born, the insurance industry would estimate about 36 strong weather disasters a year. Today, we are at 365. So in other words, every day of the year, somewhere on the planet, there is an extreme weather event, and that severity and that frequency of extreme weather events is obviously climate change. But we wasted decades in debating whether or whether not climate change is happening, whether or whether not it's man-made. And of course, that was not an innocent discussion, but that was a discussion that was heavily steered by PR agencies who received a lot of money for that. But then I don't want to, sink you in doom and gloom. I would actually say that the food systems and the way we are producing and consuming, and unfortunately all too often wasting food, is maybe our one out of prison card out of this climate quagmire. Because nowhere else you would have more people on the planet who were all too ready and all too willing to work very hard, to work the land, to improve the fertility of soils, to put carbon back in the soil, if we are prepared to pay a little for that. One of the things I'm most proud of in the World Food Programme is our land restoration project. We are basically, along all of the Sahelian countries, we are restoring land. You might have seen the methodology. It's as simple as striking, because when you have a little bit of a hilly landscape and rain comes, and mind you, in places like northern Niger, you still have 350 or 400 milliliters of rain a year. We are working with the local women, and it is indeed overwhelmingly women, because these places are so poor that most of the men have left to the capital cities trying to find a job, and those who are left are the women and children. But we work with these women to basically contour the land. Imagine you have a 2-meter wide half moon built out of digging a little bit and stones around it. It works like a micro dam, like a little water dam, but really tiny. I could span it with my hands, right? So when the rain comes, it doesn't just go downhill, and rapidly so, because often you have very strong extreme rainfall. It actually sort of cascades from pool to pool to pool, slowing down, staying longer in these little artificial pools that gives the water the time to infiltrate the soil. Now, in that half moon, there are several spots where we have deeper holes in which we put just very simple biomass. Often it's a mixture of straw and dung. It's really as low-tech as it possibly gets. Now, this works like a sponge, right? The water stays in that, and we can put in a little seedling of a very resistant variety of a tree. So that tree survives. Next thing you know is when the tree is 2-3 meters high, provides shadow. In the shadow, the ground temperature goes down by maybe 4 to 6 degrees. It's getting more humid, and in the shadow of those trees, you can start agriculture. You're basically creating all the circle of life, all the biosystem back that was lost before. And the results are staggering. We have some places where even in the dry season, you still have streams. Suddenly biodiversity is coming back. Suddenly there are animals that haven't been seen in the area for a long time. And you can check that on our website if you want to see a video. And I can share after that a YouTube video that was done by an American YouTuber about our project that got, I think, 7 million hits in 1 week. So we are in a new reality, becoming a YouTube wonder as the World Food Programme. But these programs are really helping us to get carbon back in the soil, to manage the water, to actually do something about the climate right away. And my core point is, those people are literally dirt cheap. If they could get a little bit of the carbon benefit they are creating, if there were a global system by which we in rich countries would just pay a tiny bit more for our products, for the climate footprint, and those smallholder farmers would get that as a topping up of their salary, which we can do today because we have blockchain, we have digital banking. We can, with pinpoint accuracy, not only send the money to the smallholder farmers, we can also verify with the latest satellite generation what's actually happening on the ground. We would have a giant opportunity to really turn the bottom billion of this planet into a workforce for the climate, giving people income, giving people livelihoods, giving people dignity. So that's basically what I'm trying to work on. And then what you also, of course, witness every day is just a wildfire of conflicts around the planet, where every year we are adding more wars, more conflicts to an already troubled world. We have twice the number of live conflicts that we had 10 years ago. And we see the global repercussions of these conflicts. When Russia invaded Ukraine, for example, it was not only a nightmare for the population of Ukraine. We have seen grain prices exploding all over the place. We were not surprised to see in the Middle East and North African region prices going up, because of course Lebanon, Egypt are big importers of Ukrainian grain. If you just look at the map, it's obvious, but we have seen repercussions in places as far away as South Africa or Middle America. And so that also shows you the vulnerability of a global food system. And in the case of Ukraine, it's a triple tragedy, because Ukraine is not only one of the most fertile areas of the world, it's also a country that is relatively well positioned in a climate change world. So it's the prime of the prime of the prime agricultural producer, where we are seeing live fighting, where we see about a quarter of the land being not usable anymore because of unexploded ammunition and landmines. So a total disaster on this size as well. Okay. Food systems. What else would I need to say before I shut up and I let you ask and comment on what I said? Maybe one more thing. In our food systems, and you will witness that every day, we afford ourselves to an incredible amount of waste. We have in rich countries about 36% of food waste. You buy 3 apples, 1 typically ends up in a trash can. And it's not only apples, it's also very high value foods like meat, like fish. You go to a local deli on Saturday evening and you still find the full choice of sushi. Well, guess what's happening until Monday morning? All of that is ending up in a trash can. This enormous amount of waste is actually mirrored in many developing countries by about the same number of post-harvest losses. Basically meaning that food is growing, it's there, it's perfectly fine for consumption, but it doesn't make their way to the families because there is no road, because there is no refrigeration, because there is no simple processing like drying or smoking or putting stuff in cans. And so we are coming to absurd situations that in South Sudan, we have about 70% of the production rotting, while the people are hungry at the same time. Just does not make sense. And so if you even take a hard-nosed economic perspective, you should say, well, you know, this is madness, the amount of food we are wasting. And it's only one madness, because I said at the outset, 800 million, give or take 20, chronically food insecure. It's 1/3 of a billion who don't know where their next meal is coming from. And at the same time, more than 1 billion people who are obese. So, you know, the hidden costs of the health costs are just enormous. And what we need to do, and I see you, Bruce, I'm wrapping up. What we need to do is to think these things together, and we need to put our food security questions first. And I'm seeing that slowly happening, that heads of states and even places like the Munich Security Conference are actually now speaking about food systems, because there will not be a safe and stable and rules-based world until we get this right. So let me stop here and very happy to discuss and take your questions.
Thank you very, very much for that orientation with a wealth of information. And I'd like to dig in with the first question. Right now in the course we are in, focusing on EU and US climate change mitigation, but also going to the top with the United Nations. That's where we are right now. And we're looking at the Paris Agreement and the annual COP meetings. And I'm imagining that you took this information and these recommendations to COP28. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experience there and whether or not you see action that you would welcome.
Right. Excellent question. And full disclosure, I was in a previous life the senior director of UNFCCC of the climate negotiations. One thing which is fundamental about the Paris Agreement to understand is that it is the child of the Copenhagen Accord. And in Copenhagen, the whole negotiations broke down, and the logic of creating a globally binding instrument that is transpiring into national legislation that makes climate goals binding basically collapsed. And ever since, we had the logic turned upside down. So voluntary pledges that would then be reported to a register, which is UNFCCC, in the hope that these voluntary pledges add up to a climate-safe world. This is what the Paris Agreement basically sealed and put on a piece of paper. And in a nutshell, it's not working, because all of these voluntary pledges do not, even on paper, add up to what we need to stay safely below 1.5 degrees. Far from it. And that doesn't even take into account whether or whether not all these national action plans are actually implemented. So in terms of negotiations, there is nothing left to negotiate. The Paris Agreement is there, the rule book is there, all the action now needs to come in the nationally determined contribution, which are the national climate plans under the Paris Agreement, and to ensure that those plans actually add up to a climate-safe world. Now, as I said, they don't, and they are far from it, and emissions are still going up, which is a total disaster. But what you see at the COPs is that the food sector and the possibilities we have there, in drastically reducing the emissions from agriculture by better, more diverse, more organic food systems, but on the other side, to even sequester carbon and reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is increasingly acknowledged. It is not that it makes its way into a legally binding agreement of sorts, but what it does, it serves as a crystallization point for alliances of countries who feel similarly. But even that is facing a very hard time. The European Union obviously was a champion with the farm to fork strategy and the Green New Deal for sustainable agriculture and more nature conform, not even nature positive, but less harmful agriculture. But it's facing a very difficult time. And with the farmers' protests, it seems like those farmers who are basically producing at large scale, input intensive, are currently winning the battle of narratives. So the COP is basically what it is. It's a big stage. You get global visibility. You can grab the attention of member states all the way up to heads of states. But we are still far, really, from having a comprehensive inclusion of food-related questions in the climate world, which would be the case if they would be part of the binding climate plans that every nation is defining for themselves.
Thank you very much for that assessment. We're going to take time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, and we're going to turn the camera around now. And I would like to see a hand from the first student who would like to ask a question today.
I don't have any goodies to give for the first question, although there's a possibility to intern with the World Food Program, if that's a little incentive. But fire away, there must be something that's resonating, or where you say this is total nonsense, and I will convince you of the opposite. Please.
We are representing a number of countries in the room today, and the first hand was raised by someone who has a background in Hungary.
I just want to know a little bit more about food waste, because I feel like in developed countries it's quite a big issue. And I just want to know on the policy side and government side what things can be done, because I know there's organizations like Food Sharing and Good to Go that are kind of organized by organizations, but what can be done more on the policy and government side to kind of reduce the waste that we have in developed countries?
Great question. One of the champion countries that actually gets it quite right is Denmark. It's interesting to see what they do. And one of the entry points to reduce food waste is actually acknowledging the fact that in most of our countries, I don't know about Hungary, but I'm sure that it's not dissimilar in your country from many other European countries, we now have more than 50% of the meals are actually served outside the house. So people eat out all the time, or if they are in, they are buying a lot of stuff from delivery services. So when you think about universities, hospitals, kindergartens, all of that, there is a way, because it's public procurement, to make some of the food waste regulations binding. So that's not covering all of society, but it's covering a sizable chunk of that. And then there are really interesting concepts. There are startups all over Europe that are trying to connect surplus with demand, where you can get a paper bag full of food for very little money if you're on the app, which I think is super interesting. When I was a student, I pretended to be vegetarian. I was not, but because they were not prepared to deal with a vegetarian, they gave me a full bag of food. And so I could survive a couple of days with that sort of similar concept. One of the things I have learned about is quite interesting. It's a big French supermarket chain who basically replaced the little stickers that you have on the food for the price by small digital displays. And they are constantly discounting the products until they come to their to sell by date. So the milk would be initially, I don't know, €1.60, and then if you come next day, it's €1.30, and it goes down. It gets cheaper all the time, while it's still perfectly good for consumption. So you incentivize also your consumers to buy the products that actually end soonest. What I do in my own life, I very often buy stuff past expiry date, never made bad experiences other than that it's cheaper than the other food. You can encourage that. You can do campaigning to inform people that, your milk is not turning sour exactly at 12 o'clock of this day, but typically lasts for another 4 or 5 days before it really gets bad. And also, a bit of education. But in some cases, regulation is actually the way to go, I think.
Well, Frick, we would like to thank you very much for spending this time with us. And I have 2 questions moving forward. One is, if it should be the case that we have more questions we would like to address to you, would it be okay to do that in writing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm happy to stay in touch. I'm also on X, formerly Twitter, tweet a lot about this stuff, on LinkedIn, whatever works for you to connect.
All right. Thank you very much for that also. And the second question is, will you have to leave us immediately now, or do you have time to stay with us a few more minutes?
I think I can stay on a little bit. I need to watch the 2 or 3 messages that came in, but I will be listening. You see me off camera for a second, but I will be following and I come back. All
right. Then thank you very much again. And we now are going to move from Hamburg even further north to Oslo in Norway, where Dr. Christine Voigt is joining us between two appointments she has. One ended at 2 o'clock this afternoon. The other one is starting at 5 o'clock this afternoon. And we feel very, very thankful that she is willing to join us now. And I am going to say a few introductory words about Dr. Voigt. And you will be able to read along with me. Dr. Christina Voigt is a professor of law at the University of Oslo in Norway. She is an internationally renowned expert in international environmental law and teaches, speaks, and publishes widely on legal issues of climate change, environmental multilateralism, and sustainability. From 2009 to 2018, she worked as principal legal advisor for the government of Norway in its UN climate negotiations, and negotiated the Paris Agreement and its rulebook. Professor Voigt is chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and co-chair of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee. She also is the mother of two young boys, Victor and Oscar. And we are going to now return to the screen and shift to Dr. Voigt. And let's see here now. There we go. And oops. Dr. Voigt, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me back. I hope this is a good sign that the last time you invited me to speak to your students was not terribly unsuccessful. Thank you also for your kind introduction. It's a long list of things, and I have to say that my two boys are not that young anymore. They have a tendency to grow up very quickly. But I also wanted to thank you for inviting Martin Frick. It was very interesting to listen to you, Martin. I listened very carefully. And I hope I can use some of what you said as a segue. But of course, it's a hard step to follow. But Bruce, you invited me to speak a little bit more about COP28, and I'm happy to do so. And you just mentioned I'm also the co-chair of the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, which is becoming increasingly important because that's the only body that we have currently that looks actually after whether parties comply with their obligations under the Paris Agreement. And as Martin just said, there are few and far in between, but at least they have some obligations, and it's very important that they comply with those. But I think I may just kick off with COP28. Martin just mentioned some aspects there, and I'm happy to build on them. Before I got there, I think I just wanted to say some more general observations about the Paris Agreement, building a little bit on what Martin said. I think it's absolutely true that it is born out of Copenhagen and the idea that parties come forward with their own pledges, which are called nationally determined contributions, and they do that regularly every 5 years to put forward their national contribution. And it's also very correct that these the content of these NDCs, that they're called, is not legally binding. That's a legacy from Paris, from Copenhagen. But where I would like to respectfully disagree with what Martin said is the statement that the Paris Agreement is not functioning, it's not working. I think that is way too early to judge. The only thing we know currently is that the current ambition in the NDCs is not corresponding to the 1.5-degree target. And of course, we still have to see whether parties are implementing their NDCs. But the whole point of having the Paris Agreement is to have the obligation of parties to put forward new NDCs every 5 years. And it's an iterative moment that applies to every single party. Next time is in 2025 and then in 2030. And every time parties put forward their NDCs, those NDCs have to progress in the level of ambition, and they also have to be informed by the outcomes of the global stocktake. So the fact that currently NDCs are not ambitious enough is, of course, a design element of the Paris Agreement, which is meant to take parties from where they were and where they are to getting them to where they need to be. So I think any statement that the Paris Agreement is not working is way too early. It's too early to judge, because some of the processes are just kicking into motion. One of them is, of course, the global stocktake that we just had last year. The next one is the reporting that parties have to do, which for the first time happens at the end of this year. So we're very early in the implementation of those iterative processes of the Paris Agreement, and we have to give it a chance, because it is really the only agreement out there that brings states together. And in the absence of it, there really isn't anything else. And of course, it would be desirable perhaps to have an agreement that contains legally binding obligations for every single party in terms of emission reductions, but we don't have it, and the political space isn't there. And in the absence of that, I think we need to protect and defend the Paris Agreement. So in that sense, please let me get back to COP28. I do have some slides which I have to try to find. Give me a second, because it's always a technical challenge. Oh God, I see a lot of things. What I don't see are my slides. Why are they not there? Let me just see. I work with 2 screens, which is a headache. But I really can't find them. It's not a problem, but it's not desirable either. Any help would be screen 1, screen 2. No. Okay, give me a moment here to see. Well, in any case, I can't open it, but it doesn't matter. You will have to listen to my voice without any beautiful pictures. That's perhaps a pity, but it shouldn't be such a big problem. So Martin already mentioned COP28. It's the conference of the parties, as you perhaps know, which happens every year, with the exception that during the pandemic, for 2 weeks at the end of the year. And that's the moment where all the parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol come together. And the last one was in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. Also for the 28th time that it happened, and this year it's going to be, of course, the 29th time, which is going to take place in Baku in Azerbaijan, and next year for the 30th time it will be in Belém in Brazil. Now, the interesting thing about COP28, and I do apologize that I have to look a little bit to the side, but that's where my slides are right now on my screen. The interesting thing about COP28, and that's something that you may want to discuss perhaps within your class, is that it was the biggest of its kind. This is, of course, it has a positive and perhaps also a negative side. At COP28, we had 150 heads of state attending at the very first day. We had heads of state attending prior to that at these COPs in Paris and in Copenhagen, but also in Glasgow. But as far as I know, never more than 150. That is quite a unique size, in particular for a COP that was not meant to deliver a new agreement like the Paris Agreement, or any particular important step on the way other than the first global stocktake. But the second biggest of its kind was the sheer number of participants. There were days when the count was at about 100,000 people participating at that COP, and that is unprecedented. The second biggest COP had about 42,000 participants. So we saw like more than doubling in Dubai compared to the second biggest meeting of that kind ever before. And you may want to ask, is that necessary or not? And there are good arguments for both. But those that actually sit and negotiate new decisions by the Conference of the Parties are maybe at the most 10,000 people, which means that 90,000 people are there for other reasons. And that may be civil society, observers, lobbyists. There are a lot of interest groups that are represented. But there was an article in the New York Times somewhere halfway through the COP, which said that outside the negotiation rooms, COP28 is part trade fair, part lobbyist jamboree, and part debate tournament. And that's really interesting because outside the negotiation, there's so much else going on, a lot of side events, a lot of discussion rounds that are kind of overtaken the whole COP, where the negotiations themselves have become the sideshow and everything else is moving much more centrally, which is perhaps also a good thing because it keeps the climate discourse at the core of all sorts of interactions that happen at the COP. Now, let me briefly address some of the core results and why COP28 did actually deliver very important steps forward. I think one thing that Martin said is very important, that there are not really any core negotiating items more that need to be resolved. Most of what we have is decided. It's either in the Paris Agreement or in its rule book. There is not much more that necessarily has to fall in place in order to generate effective climate action. The most important thing in my view is really now to implement the Paris Agreement effectively and get to NDCs in 2025 that are higher in ambition and correspond to the 1.5 degree target and what the IPCC tells us. However, there are two outcomes from COP28 that are important and that push the envelope a little bit further. One is a decision that was taken at the very first day, and the other one is a decision that was taken at the very last day. So the very first day, a decision was taken by the governing body of the Paris Agreement, which is actually not called the COP, but the CMA, the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of parties to the Paris Agreement. And that decision was the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. And I'll say a couple of words about this in a moment. And the decision taken at the very last day was the outcome of the first global stocktake, which in my view is perhaps the most important outcome of that meeting in Dubai, because it gives an indication of what parties now have to take into account when designing and revising their current NDCs and preparing for the communication of their next NDC, which has to happen at the latest in February 2025. So this is really around the corner, less than a year from now, because it has to happen 9 to 12 months prior to the COP in 2025, which is in Brazil, as I already mentioned. So there is a lot of input from that decision on the global stocktake, which now hopefully feeds into domestic processes to prepare the next NDC. So let me say first a couple of words on that loss and damage fund decision. On the background to it, as you perhaps know, loss and damage, addressing the impacts of climate change, and Martin very excellently outlined how climate change currently already affects, in particular, the most vulnerable peoples and groups, communities, but also individuals on this planet. But it is nothing compared to what is about to come, because if climate change continues, and it will, the impacts of climate change go far beyond any adaptive capacity that we currently have, and will result in losses and damages associated with climate change. But the issue of loss and damage for many, many years has been a very contentious one. It was something at the very high at the list of priorities for small island developing states, for least developing countries, for many African states, but it was something that did not really find its way into the negotiations. In 2013, parties established the Warsaw Mechanism to address losses and damages, but it was kind of an institution that never really took off the ground. So when the Paris Agreement was negotiated, there was a very strong red line by small island developing states that they said they had to see reference to loss and damage in the agreement, otherwise there would not be any agreement at all. And they meant it. And for that reason, we now have Article 8 in the Paris Agreement, which recognizes the importance of averting and minimizing and addressing losses and damages. But it did come at the compromise, as always, because in the decision that adopted the Paris Agreement, there is a waiver that says that Article 8 in the Paris Agreement cannot be used or cannot establish liability and compensation for loss and damage. There's always this trade-off that we see in international negotiations. In any case, we have Article 8, which addresses losses and damage in the Paris Agreement, but that Article 8 and loss and damage never had any funding behind it, because it's nice to recognize loss and damage, but it's worth very little if there is no money on the table to actually address it. And that has been a very important topic in the negotiation ever since the Paris Agreement was adopted. Now, not in COP28, but in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, parties agreed on account or initiated by African states and small island developing states, parties agreed on the establishment of financial arrangements for loss and damage, including the establishment of a loss and damage fund. So that happened already in 2022, that the fund was established, but that's also where it stopped. It was basically the bucket was put on the table called fund, but there were no guidelines around it. There was no details of how this fund is supposed to work. So that took another year until 2023. There was a transitional committee that worked in the meantime, very hard negotiations, and then provided a draft for how this fund is supposed to work. And that draft, against all odds, was adopted at the very first day of the meeting in Dubai, which was primarily due to the outreach by the presidency, by the United Arab Emirates. They made sure that this was acceptable to everyone, and apparently it was. And now we have a bit more detail on how that loss and damage fund is supposed to function. The purpose of the fund is to assist developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in addressing losses and damage. So the big question now, of course, is who is particularly vulnerable? Because depending on the context, and Martin was giving some examples with respect to food security, many different countries are particularly vulnerable in different aspects of climate impacts. And the example of Haiti or small island developing states is very telling. So we know that the fund is there to assist countries, developing countries that are particularly vulnerable. And that's going to be based on a priority and needs assessment, which is going to be a very difficult decision, I'm sure, for the board of the fund to make. Who is to be prioritized? Whose needs should be addressed through this fund? But this is something that we will have to see how it works in practice, but the guidelines are at least in place now. How is the fund supposed to be operated? Well, there is going to be a board for the fund and an specific secretariat, but both are not in place. So in the meantime, as an interim, it is the World Bank and the UNFCCC secretariat, which Martin knows quite well, who will work as an interim arrangement until the fund board and its own secretariat will be established. And the billion-dollar question, literally, is who is going to pay into this fund? Where is the money going to come from? And here the guidelines are not very clear, because they say that the fund is able to receive contributions from a wide variety of sources of funding, including grants and concessional loans from public, private, and innovative sources as appropriate. So we see many things here. We see that's not a specific reference to developed country parties, but it's just an open invitation basically to everyone. And it's a wide variety of sources, can also be public, private, and other types of sources. One thing, it's good that's an invitation to everyone, but also there is a danger that nobody in particular feels that, you know, they have a responsibility to be paying into the fund. But we'll have to see how things work out. The latest numbers that I've seen is that the fund currently is capitalized with just under 700 million US dollars, which is of course very, very little compared to the needs that will arise with respect to addressing and dealing with climate losses and damages. Interesting, what happened in Dubai was that the host country, the United Arab Emirates, pledged $100 million into this fund, compared, for example, to the United States of America, which pledged 17.5 million, or other countries who even pledged less. So the host country, not necessarily a developed country in the context of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, pledged a significant contribution to that fund. Okay, so leaving that outcome of COP28 aside, moving to the second important outcome that happened at the very last day, which actually went one day over the scheduled time, but that's a usual usual thing that happens at these COPs, is that the decision on the outcome of the first global stocktake was adopted. Now, the global stock, and here we have quite a division of opinion. So partly that decision was hailed as historic and fantastic, historic climate deal reached. And I have wonderful pictures here on my slide, which I unfortunately cannot share with you. At the same time, we had pictures of tears and frustration by others who said that it was a historic failure. Now, I don't want to take a side here. Actually, I think it's quite a good decision, but of course it has its shortcomings. I don't think it was a historic failure, but I leave the final decision up to you. You can make up your own mind about that. So what is special about this decision? First of all, the global stocktake is a design element of the Paris Agreement. The global stocktake is taking place every 5 years from now on. So for the first time in 2023, but now this is going to happen every 5 years, 2028, and then so forth. And it will always happen 2 years prior to the next round of NDCs is due. So it happened now in 2023, and the next round of NDCs is due in 2025. So the next global stocktake takes place in 2028, and the next round of NDCs is due in 2030. And so it will continue. It's always 2 years prior to the next the next round of NDC communication. And there's a reason for that. It takes place 2 years prior to that, so that states can take into account, and they have to take into account, the outcome of the global stocktake, be informed by it, and include what's in the global stocktake decision in their, break it down to their national circumstances and include it in their NDCs. So when the Paris Agreement was negotiated, the idea was, as I said, to have these iterative processes that NDCs have to be communicated every 5 years, but in between there is the stocktake, which takes place of the stock of the collective progress of parties towards the goal of the agreement. And the idea was that it would always be not enough. The global stocktake would always have an outcome saying, great parties, wonderful, you do a lot, but it's not enough. Go home and do better. That's basically what the global stocktake is supposed to do. Go home, be informed by the global stocktake, and do better, because the next NDC has to progress in ambition, which is written into the Paris Agreement in Article 4, Paragraph 3. So when we look at the global stocktake decision from Dubai, we have to take this into account, that the global stocktake is there to inform parties when they communicate their next NDCs. Now, what the decision from Dubai did is very interesting. It's actually quite a long decision. If you look at the media coverage, you would think it's just one paragraph, but it actually is so much more. First of all, it recognizes very clearly the global pathway towards net zero emissions, which corresponds in 2050, which corresponds more or less with holding warming to 1.5 degrees with hopefully just limited overshoot. And here we have a paragraph which states out that by 2030, emissions have to be reduced by about 43%. But in 2035, only 3 years later, the emission reductions have to increase to 60%. This is completely new, that within the 5-year timeline from 2030 to 2035, we have to see a drastic increase in ambition from around 43% to 60% of global reductions of emissions by 2030. So in order to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and net zero means that all the human-based emissions are balanced with removals, which is only possible if we drastically reduce emissions and increase removals, in particular in forests, in lands, in wetlands, increase carbon uptake in the soil, as Martin explained, but most likely also have to look at carbon capture and storage in the meantime in order to get to that balance by 2050. Now, that's an important aspect of the global stocktake decision. Another important aspect is paragraph 28, which was very much addressed in the media, which sets out a whole list of what is called global efforts that should be or need to be taken place, but they also need to be broken down now to individual efforts for every single party. And here we see, for example, tripling of renewable energy capacity by 2030, phase down of unabated coal power. We see transitioning away from fossil fuels and energy systems, which was maybe the most discussed issue in this whole context, because some parties wanted to see the wording phase out of fossil fuels in energy systems, but the final conclusion or final compromise was to transitioning away from fossil fuels. It is more than a semantic difference, but I think the most important thing here, and we have to recognize, is that as all fossil fuels for the first time ever are mentioned in a decision, and it's not just coal, but it actually goes to the heart of the fossil-based energy systems, whether it's oil or gas or coal, and indicates that we have to move away from that. We have to see the end of this in order to ensure that there is a chance to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. There's also now a mentioning of nuclear energy, which apparently media didn't pick up at all, but which is also new and something that, you know, you may discuss and find positive or negative, but these transitioning or transitional technologies in order to get to renewable, to increase renewable capacity is something that needs to be addressed. In addition, we have phasing out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, very important aspect. So it's a whole category, a whole list of to-dos for states, which they now have to take into account and use in their design of their next NDCs. It's an obligation where it says that parties shall, or the outcome of the global stocktake shall inform parties in their next NDCs. Another important aspect of the global stocktake decision is also recognition that nature matters, that biodiversity matters. The decision emphasizes the importance of conserving, protecting, and restoring nature and ecosystems, which speaks a little bit also to the point that Martin made, and that food systems, if done in a nature-friendly way, can help to address like triple challenges: food shortages, nature protection, as well as biodiversity. So they're a win-win-win situation, which I think need to be thought through more, implemented more, and scaled up significantly. There is also reference to halting and reversing deforestation and forest degradation by 2030. That's a very concrete goal, hopefully to be achieved, as well as the need to protect and restore oceans and ecosystems, which I mention these aspects because I think these are very important indicators now that inform states in their domestic processes on how important it is to protect and conserve nature at the same time as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in particular from industrial and energy sectors. So what's next? Very important, and I already mentioned that many times, is that every single party early next year has to communicate a new NDC. And I can also say that as the co-chair of the compliance committee, because the committee has the mandate at least to check whether parties will have communicated a next NDC. Now, this is due by February 2025 at the latest. Some parties already submitted next NDCs, but by by February next year, every single party will have to do that. And those NDCs will have to increase in ambition compared to the current one and reflect each party's highest possible ambition. And that's the whole idea, is to get from that insufficient ambition that we currently have, that Martin also mentioned, to one that takes us closer to holding holding warming to 1.5 degrees. Also, very importantly, for the first time ever, at the end of this year, on the 31st of December this year, every single party has to provide a report on how well it is doing in implementing and achieving its NDC. We haven't seen those reports yet, or at least 1 or 2 parties have submitted them, but for everyone else, it's due by the end of this year. And that's a very interesting aspect because, as Martin said, the NDCs are not legally binding. What parties put in there is not legally binding. But nevertheless, parties have to provide very detailed information on their progress in achieving and implementing their NDCs. And the idea is to create transparency, right, for everyone to see that information. In particular, also for domestic stakeholder, which then can, exert pressure on their governments, but also for everyone else. There is a possibility for peer pressure. There is a possibility for global stakeholder, for civil society, for NGOs to use that information and either be critical of states if they're not doing enough, if they're not implementing their NDCs well enough, or to also give some praise, at least to those states who do quite well. So there is an important aspect in that transparency element of the Paris Agreement, which should be used by everyone, interested in climate change. Use that civil space or civic space that the agreement provides, in particular to that access to information from every single state. Now, this was all on COP28, Bruce, and I wonder how much you want me to talk about the Paris Agreement Compliance Committee, or whether you would rather want to take some questions.
Thank you very, very much for the wealth of information that you offered about COP28. And I'd like to accept some responsibility for you not being able to share your slides. It's possible that I had granted you co-host rights to share your screen, but it might have been good for us to talk a little bit more about that beforehand, and I apologize for that.
No. It's not your fault, Bruce. I can assure you. I could share the screen. I just couldn't find my presentation on my second screen. That's a technological hiccup on my side. No fault on yours.
Before I ask Dr. Frick if he would like to respond at all, I'd like to ask one question, and that is if you might be willing to share the presentation slides with us and that we can look at them after today in a review kind of way. I think that would be effective.
Yeah, that's very pedagogical. Now you can you can review it all. No, I'm more than happy to, Bruce. I'll send them to you. And I said I apologize for not having been able to use them in the presentation, but you can enjoy the nice pictures later.
And I do want to ask a question, not right now, but about PAICC and the operationalization of it in 2023 and the experience with that now moving into 2024. But first, I would like to invite Martin Frick to respond to anything he might like to respond, also as kind of a prize for being willing to stay with us on a very busy day. Martin?
It's so much more comprehensible if you hit unmute, right? No, I wanted to thank Christina, and just to get this right, I was one of the people jubilant when the Paris Agreement came through, and I know it was by far exceeding any expectation at the time. And I'm not talking that down. It reminds me, many years back, I was the EU's lead negotiator in negotiating the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which is there. The criticism is very similar, saying it doesn't do enough for human rights, but the instrument is there and it could work on the touch of a button. And it's the same with the Paris Agreement. All of the things are there. And if countries come with very substantive, robust and monitored NDCs, this thing works. No two ways about it. What really scares me is the speed by which we are seeing the environmental changes caused by climate change, and also latest science that really show us how close we are, and if we are not already in the midst of tipping points. So I've been with UNFCCC after the Paris Agreement, and I think there was a massive strategic mistake at that time to sort of overemphasize all the small print of the Paris Agreement and just dive into the next explicit round of negotiations, although that was needed, when the spirit should have been from 2015 onwards. Now we have the instrument, let's all focus on implementation. And that delay and that space was unfortunately used by the not so friendly actors to ask more questions, to make it complicated, to protract. The instrument itself, I totally agree, is there. We need to make it work, and we have very little time to make it work. And I think my point on food systems is it's not only massive in size, it is actually something that you can activate within a very short period of time, while transitioning an energy or a transport system might be a much more longer perspective. But in food systems, you can get things right from the next harvest onwards. But many thanks, Christina, also for this excellent overview of all of the current work in UNFCCC. And I know very well how much and how hard work goes into it to make that happen. Thank you.
I'd like to act kind of as a segue comment questioner now. And it seems to me we're focusing on implementation and compliance. And even though there was a slow start, it seems to me as though the progress now is speeding up, and that it has in the 2023 with PAICC becoming operational. And it also seems to me that PAICC, and this is my question, might now, after the global stocktake, in this period where the parties begin to submit their next NDCs, take into account what was decided at COP28, and that is the tripling of the renewable energy capacity and doubling of energy efficiency annually to 2030. Will the PAICC have an opportunity to refer to those goals for 2030 as it now continues to monitor and communicate with the parties?
Well, there's a very simple answer to that question, Bruce, and the answer is no. As I said earlier, PAICC, the Paris Agreement Compliance Committee is there to check whether parties are complying with their legal obligations under the Paris Agreement. That's whether they have an NDC or not, whether they communicate a new NDC every 5 years, whether they provide their reports every other year, which is now the biennial transparency report is due. This is what the compliance committee will check on. Do parties submit a new NDC in 2025 or not? Do they submit their biennial transparency report this year, 2026, and so forth, or not? But the committee is not mandated to kind of open the report and check whether the content of the report is good enough or is ambitious enough, or if the NDC is corresponding to the global stocktake decision, for example. That would have been fantastic. I would have loved for PAICC to have that possibility to also look actually at the substantive commitments of parties. But for the whole, negotiation history, it was very, very difficult to get a compliance element into the Paris Agreement. There was super strong objection to it because several parties, from all sorts of different areas feared that this was exceeding the mandate for negotiating Paris, or it was something that didn't fit well with the new idea of, bottom-up pledges, and now you have a compliance committee, and what is it supposed to do? So it was super difficult to actually get a compliance committee into the overall structure. And one of the compromises to ensure that we do have a compliance committee was that it could only check on those obligations that are really legally binding, and that these are procedural obligations, right? These are the obligations to communicate an NDC, to communicate reporting, and so forth. So that's unfortunate, but it's one of those compromises that needed to be in place, because the alternative would have been to have no compliance body that at least is able to check on these core legal obligations. So that's the short and the little bit longer answer to your question, Bruce, which I get a lot, because now with the next round of NDCs coming close, there is also a requirement of progression, of highest possible ambition, and the question is, can PAICC look into this? And unfortunately, it cannot, but it can check whether parties have communicated another NDC in 2025, and that's a little bit of the of the overall picture, which is important.
Could you also say a few words about the implementation part and how PAICC is mandated to help with building capacity and offering technological assistance and other means?
Absolutely. I mean, just one more word to your previous question, because you mentioned that PAICC has become operational, which is correct. So in 2022 in Egypt, the whole set of rules of procedure were adopted, which enabled PAICC to now actually become operational. And we had our first two cases in 2023. There was one situation where one party did not have an NDC, and we had one situation where a party did not submit a mandatory report. And PAICC reached out to these parties and, basically sent a letter or an email in this case, and asking, what is the situation? Are you aware of your obligations? And if so, how can we help? And that was enough. That was enough for both parties to, check what's going wrong and immediately remedy that and send in the mandatory requirements within a couple of weeks. It was just enough to get that letter. And that is kind of a good signal, right? It shows that, parties do not like to get, an email from the compliance committee, but if it happens, they also immediately, at least in those two examples, turn around and submit the necessary obligation or comply with the necessary obligation. Now, to your question, there's an implementation element, right? It's the Paris Agreement implementation and compliance committee. And what does the implementation part do? Now, the idea was and is that, well, other way around. Any party at any time could come to the committee. If any party has a challenge in implementing any part of the Paris Agreement, and that doesn't have to be a legal obligation, it could come to the committee and say, we have a challenge. We don't know how to design our next adaptation plan, for example, which is not a legal obligation. But a party wants to do it in accordance with the rules, but maybe it doesn't have the capacity, it doesn't have the full set of technology or whatever it is. It meets a challenge. It could come to the committee on its own behalf, and the committee would try to help to find out what the problem is and maybe also a way how to resolve it. That hasn't happened yet, and maybe the likelihood of that ever to happen is fairly limited, because parties do not necessarily come to a compliance and implementation committee. But at the same time, it's also not so well known that the committee has that mandate, has that function as well. It's not just like looking at compliance and sending letters. It is also helping parties in preventing that they, get to situations of non-compliance, because it's so much more important to prevent that situation from happening than dealing with it after the fact. So this is, maybe to your question about this implementation component, it is there to help and support parties in a facilitative manner to meet all their commitments under the agreement.
We are moving the camera once again so that during the final 5 minutes, we can have 1 or 2 questions from our audience. And last time the question came fairly quickly. I'm hoping that the first question comes even quicker this time. Who is ready to answer a question about COP28 and the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee? Yes, we're saying we're representing a number of countries here, and this student who will ask a question is from Rome, where the Vatican City is.
I wanted to ask you something about the NDCAC and the countries that did not uploaded it. We saw last session, like here in class, that Vatican did not upload its NDCAC. I don't know if it was the state that you were like saying before that did not like have legal obligation, but I wanted to ask you if a country, a party does not upload its NDCAC and you send like the email or whatever and they continue not to upload it, there are some legal consequences, like I don't know, some legal obligation that.
Were you able to hear the question?
Yeah, I was able to hear the question. I can't speak of any country in particular, so that I refrain from addressing which party that was or what happened. But to your general part of the question, what are the legal consequences if a party does not comply or is found to be in non-compliance? Now, first and foremost, the function of the committee is to try everything to get the party back into compliance, right? It is not supposed to be punishing or sanctioning or anything that party. It has a facilitative role, and it's much more important to try everything to make the party, be back in compliance. For example, send their NDC or whatever it is that is not in place by a party. It's very concretely written into the rules for the committee that it's not a dispute settlement body. It's not there to have any punitive damages to apply. The most how can I say, the one possibility that the committee has, and that's really only if a party absolutely does not comply and it doesn't work with a committee and nothing happens, is a statement of fact. So the committee, at the end of a long process with a party, and if the party is not in compliance, can make a public statement. And that hasn't happened yet, and hopefully it will never happen. But if a party is not in compliance, the committee can make a public statement. And you may think, that's not really a challenge, right? This is not really a sanction or anything, but it is very important, and states don't like it at all if they are called out by a committee and if there's a statement that state X is not in compliance. So they don't like it because states are proud, right? And there is a challenge to their reputation if they're being called out by a UN committee like the PAICC. So that's the most severe compliance challenge measure that the committee can adopt. But as I said, you have to see it in relation to the nature of the committee, which should try everything to get a party back into compliance. And when it comes to climate change, I think that's the most important thing we can do, rather than punishing individual parties.
Another important point here is that very strong value of the United Nations organizations working consensually means that they do establish things like the Paris Agreement, and they do set goals, and they do submit NDCs in this case. And if it is not possible for PAICC then to open and evaluate, it is possible for others outside the community to do so. And as we saw in our class, One of those is called the Climate Action Tracker. And what the PAICC is not able to do in its community of consensus can be done outside by the Climate Action Tracker. And for that reason, it is so good that all of that information is available so that there is something to open and something to evaluate. I'd like to ask if there is one more question from the audience before we conclude today, and I hope that there is. So far, we're hearing from students from various countries, and we have an Austrian student who will ask the last question today.
Basically, I just wanted to touch on the point that was made about all the theoretical tools basically being in place. What are the practical tools which follow? And what are the specific timeframes? Because as far as I'm aware, like a lot of the goals set out by, for example, the Paris Agreement have timelines in the 2030s, with deadlines in the 2030s, and that would be in about 10 years. So I was just wondering if, like, how the timeliness and enforcement of those goals actually is supposed to be implemented.
Not entirely sure I understand the question. There isn't really a time stamp on the Paris Agreement. As I tried to say, well, the next thing that's supposed to happen is the communication of the NDCs in 2025. Those NDCs that are communicated in 2025 have a timeline for 10 years. So they run from 2025 to 2035. That's the timeline for an NDC is 10 years. But in 2030, so 5 years after 2025, parties already have to communicate their next NDCs, which then run from 2030 to 2040. So there's always a small overlap in the communication of NDCs for the next NDCs. I hope you understand that. So it goes, until parties are where they need to be. And every time between those, next round of NDCs, there's a global stocktake, like 2028. And that global stocktake every time will say, well done, but not enough, go home, do better. That's the whole idea. So the Paris Agreement, it's nice that it has these, overall goals, and they're very important. But the real value of the Paris Agreement are these processes that now run again and again and again, and parties are accountable to take part in these processes, and every time they have to do better and better. And I think here it is very important to insert all the pressure that we can to the channels that we have, either as researchers, writing papers, or as civil servants, or participants in civil societal discourses, to put that pressure on governments and never ever let go ever again, because they really have to increase their ambition to where they need to be. And that's what the Paris Agreement gives us. That tool is what we have now, because those processes are scheduled. We know when they happen, exactly when. And that can be predictable, and you can develop your own strategy to comply with them.
One of the very valuable things we learned about today is that there are many, many, many thousands of people, including not only government leaders from all walks of life, who are participating in this communication process. And Christina, as you said, one part of it may seem a little bit like a debate club. And the Paris Agreement creates a framework for that, where people, like perhaps many of us, would say, we have to use this process to get to the point where we phase out fossil fuels. And we can do that with the system that the Paris Agreement has offered, but it's necessary to participate in the discussion and to apply pressure in order to accomplish that. So in a sense, as our camera has been moving back and forth for the last 90 minutes, a part of it is on experts and decision makers, but some of it is on all of us. It is our responsibility to engage and to think about Azerbaijan, Baku, and then going on to Brazil for the 30th anniversary, and use what is happening as an opportunity to say, go home and do it better, and also to do that within our regional, national, and local contexts. Christina, thank you very, very much for joining us today. I think you now have less than an hour before your next engagement, and we wish you the best for the rest of your day. And we're going to take what you have given us and look for the slide presentation and use it. What we are doing at the end of this semester is creating policy statements for suggesting how we can triple our renewable energy capacity, double our energy efficiency every year, and do everything that was pledged at COP28.
Fantastic, Bruce. And again, thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure, and I really appreciate the questions from the students. And you're right, I have my next meeting, another lecture at 5, but I'm also in the very last moment to finalize the submission to the International Court of Justice on states' obligation on climate change and the advisory proceedings there. I'm the lead legal counsel for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is, of course, another development which we haven't had time. Maybe you discuss it in other parts of your class, that the courts, and especially international courts, are now asked to join that discourse and clarify what are states' legal obligations to address climate change and protect the climate system. Another very important spot to follow. And with that, thank you so much, and back to you.
All right, we are going to be looking at judicial measures in April, and thank you very much for pointing us in that direction.
Thanks.
All right, bye-bye.